You are not listed on this manifest, and we do not seat unverified individuals in first class. Those words spoken at full volume in a cream and ebony cabin on a Saturday morning would set off a chain of events that nobody on board could have predicted when they arrived at the private terminal at O'Hare that day. Least of all the man they were directed at, who had simply stepped through the boarding door with a linen blazer folded over his arm and a coffee he hadn't finished yet. But that moment comes later. Before the words, before the confrontation, before everything that would follow and reshape the way an entire company understood itself, there was a quiet man sitting alone at a private terminal at 7:55 in the morning, watching the ground crew through floor-to-ceiling glass and thinking about almost nothing at all. Julian Moore was 46 years old, and he had learned a long time ago that the best thinking he ever did happened in the early morning stillness before the rest of the world caught up with whatever he was working on. He liked airports at this hour because airports at this hour were honest people moved through them with purpose, not performance, and nobody dressed up their intentions in the language of boardrooms or press releases. You were either going somewhere or you weren't, and the simplicity of that was something Julian had always found restful. He was dressed simply, dark trousers, a pale linen shirt, a blazer he'd folded over the handle of a single leather tote bag because the morning had turned warmer than expected. No luggage beyond that, no assistant waiting at his elbow, no driver with a placard. Just a man and a carry-on and a cup of black coffee going cold on the seat beside him, and the particular kind of stillness that belongs to people who have nothing left to prove to rooms full of strangers. This was deliberate. Julian had been to this terminal twice before in the past 6 months, both times with a full team. Both times announced, both times moving through the space in the frictionless way that wealth and recognition tended to smooth out surfaces that were rough for other people. He had noticed the smoothness. He had also noticed in the way that people who build things tend to notice what the smoothness was concealing. His phone sat face down on his knee. 3 minutes before he had closed a short message thread with Diana Cole, his executive assistant of 11 years, who had asked the same question she always asked before he did something like this. "You sure you don't want me to come?" And he had given the same answer he always gave. "I need to see it without the uniform." Diana had responded with a single period, and then after a pause a coffee cup emoji, which meant she understood and disapproved in equal measure and was choosing not to say so. The uniform in this context was not clothing. It was the invisible architecture that surrounded Julian Moore when people knew who he was, the deference and the careful language and the sudden interest in his comfort that appeared when his name was recognized and evaporated, he had begun to suspect when it wasn't. He wanted to know what the space looked like when the architecture was gone. He wanted to know what was underneath. Apex Ventures had acquired Apex Airlux 18 months ago, inheriting its roots, its staff, its reputation for discreet luxury travel among corporate clients, and buried in a compliance archive that one of his analysts had flagged during the acquisition due diligence, 34 unresolved passenger complaints filed over the preceding 14 months. Most of them read similarly. Most of them came from passengers who did not look like the majority of the clientele the previous owners had cultivated. Most of them had been marked resolved with no record of any follow-up action. Julian had read them twice. Then he had commissioned a quiet audit and waited for the findings. Then, before the findings were complete, he had decided he needed to do this himself, not because he doubted his team, but because there are certain truths that don't fully arrive until you're standing inside them. This was his third undercover ride. The first 2 had been uneventful in the particular way that made him wonder if something was protecting the operation from scrutiny. The third, he had told Diana, would be the last either way. He picked up his coffee, found it cold, and set it back down without drinking it. Outside the window, an orange-vested ground crew member guided a luggage cart across the tarmac in the early light, moving with the easy confidence of someone who had done this 1,000 times and saw no reason to perform it. Julian watched him for a moment. Then the gate agent announced pre-boarding for the Chicago to New York route, and Julian Moore stood up, folded his blazer over his arm, picked up his bag, and walked toward the jet bridge unannounced, unescorted, and entirely prepared for whatever he was about to find. The jet bridge felt longer than it was, which was a trick of the mind that Julian had noticed before, the way that narrow corridors seemed to stretch when something significant was waiting at the end of them. He walked at an even pace, not hurrying, letting the details of the morning settle into the kind of detailed observation he had trained himself to practice in these situations. The air in the bridge smelled of jet fuel and something floral from a cleaning product, and the ribbed floor made a particular sound under his shoes that he had somehow never noticed on any of his other flights, which told him something about the difference between traveling as yourself and traveling as a stranger. He had built Apex Ventures from a $12,000 loan when he was 27 years old and working out of a one-room office in the south side of Chicago with 2 employees and a business plan that 24 investors had declined before one finally said yes. That was not a story he told often, not because he was ashamed of it, but because he had discovered that people tended to use that kind of origin story as a container, something to put a person in so they could feel good about understanding them, as if the whole of a man's life was explainable by its most dramatic early chapter. Julian was not interested in being understood that way. He was interested in being useful, which was a different orientation entirely and led to different decisions. Apex Airlux had not been a strategic acquisition in the conventional sense. It had not filled a gap in the portfolio or provided obvious synergy with the firm's other holdings. It had been acquired because Julian had been on one of its flights as a client 2 years earlier and had watched something happen in the cabin that he could not stop thinking about afterward. A black businessman in the seat ahead of him questioned 3 times about the validity of his booking by a flight attendant who had checked no one else's documentation, and when the businessman had finally produced every document required and been grudgingly waved to his seat, no one had said a word. Not the other passengers, not the other crew member standing 10 feet away, not the man who owned the company Julian was about to acquire. That man had later told Julian over dinner that he ran a tight operation. Julian had nodded and thought about the businessman's face when the 3rd question was asked. 18 months later, Apex owned the tight operation, and Julian was walking down its jet bridge alone on a Saturday morning to find out how tight it still was. The route today was Chicago to New York, a 2-hour charter flight on the G65. That Apex ran 4 times a week for corporate clients. 8 seats. Julian was confirmed in 2A. He had booked under his own name, using the standard corporate portal because the test was not about whether anyone could find him if they looked. It was about whether anyone would bother to look before deciding he didn't belong. He knew one passenger by name from the manifest Diana had shared. Dominic Hale, 58, a venture capitalist who had flown Apex Air Lux 41 times in the preceding 12 months, and was, by any measure, the airline's single most frequent private client. He had also, Julian knew from the compliance file, been named in 2 of the 34 unresolved complaints, once as a direct witness who had done nothing, and once as an apparent instigator. Both complaints had been closed without contact with any of the parties involved. He knew the captain by reputation. Patricia Sloan. 52 platinum blonde hair, and an impeccable service record that Julian had read carefully 3 times without finding anything that would make a reasonable person suspicious, which was itself a thing worth being suspicious about. She had joined the operation in its previous ownership and had been retained in the acquisition on the recommendation of several long-term clients, Dominic Hale among them. Julian had flagged that particular recommendation in the margin of the acquisition file with a question mark, and then left it there for reasons he would have been unable to articulate precisely at the time. He was about to articulate them now. He also knew that he was the last to board. He had timed it deliberately, wanting to see the room already formed when he entered it, wanting to observe the default state of things before his presence changed the temperature. This was something his grandfather had taught him, an old man who had spent 40 years working maintenance in buildings where he was invisible to most of the people walking past him, and who had developed from that particular vantage point an extraordinary ability to read the mood of a room before the room knew it was being read. The last one through the door, his grandfather had said, "Once sees everything the first one missed." Julian had never forgotten it. He pressed it into practice in every new environment he entered, and the practice had served him well in ways he rarely needed to explain, because the results tended to speak without assistance. He reached the end of the jet bridge, put his hand on the door that led into the cabin, and paused for just a moment, not from hesitation but from the habit of settling himself before entering a space. Then he pushed the door open and stepped into the pale morning light of the Gulfstream G650's first-class cabin, and everything that followed began. The cabin was the kind of quiet that exists before something disrupts it, the specific quality of stillness that belongs to spaces that have been designed for comfort and are working hard at the illusion that comfort is effortless. Cream leather polished ebony trim, small reading lights casting warm pools above each seat, the faint hum of systems preparing for a flight that had not yet begun. 3 passengers already seated, 1 flight attendant moving through the galley with the practiced efficiency of someone who has memorized the choreography of the space. The flight attendant, young, maybe 26, with close-cropped natural hair and an Apex uniform she wore with what looked like genuine pride, looked up from the galley as Julian stepped through the door and offered him a smile that was immediate and unguarded. Her name tag said Brenda. She said, "Good morning, welcome aboard," in the tone of someone who meant it, and Julian nodded and said good morning back and began walking toward his seat. He got 3 steps before he understood why the cabin had felt slightly wrong when he entered. 2A was occupied. The man in it was in his late 50s, silver-haired at the temples and built with the broad-shouldered ease of someone accustomed to taking up space, dressed in a blazer that cost more than most people's monthly rent, and wearing the particular expression of a man who had decided before the situation had even presented itself that any situation was going to resolve in his favor. He was leaning back with one ankle crossed over the other knee, looking at his phone with the loose attention of a person who had no expectation of being disturbed. This was Dominic Hale. Julian checked his boarding pass against the seat number on the overhead panel. They matched. He looked at Dominic, who had not looked up. "Excuse me," Julian said, keeping his voice level and easy. "I think you're in my seat." Dominic glanced up, gave Julian a brief and uninterested assessment that took perhaps 2 seconds, and looked back at his phone. "I don't think so." Julian held up the boarding pass. 2A. That's what it says here. Dominic didn't look at the pass. Talk to the crew. It was in the middle of this exchange. Unhurried quiet, the kind of exchange that might have been resolved in 30 seconds in a different world, that Patricia Sloane stepped out of the cockpit. She was exactly as her personnel file had described. Tall, trim, platinum blonde hair pulled into a precise chignon uniform without a wrinkle, an expression that broadcast authority in the particular frequency that some people in positions of institutional power learn to project automatically before they've even assessed the situation they're projecting it at. She looked at Julian. She looked at the seat behind him, still empty. She looked back at Julian, and her expression didn't shift, but something behind it did a small, nearly invisible recalibration that Julian recognized because he had seen it before in boardrooms and restaurants and hotel lobbies and 100 other spaces across the course of his adult life. It was the look of someone deciding in the span of a heartbeat which version of a person they were dealing with and arriving at an answer that had nothing to do with the person standing in front of them. "Sir," she said, and her voice carried in the cabin with the clean authority of someone accustomed to being heard. "Do you have documentation for this booking?" Julian extended his boarding pass toward her. She did not take it. Instead, before Julian could process the refusal, Dominic Hale looked up from his phone, reached across the aisle with one hand, and plucked the boarding pass from Julian's fingers. He looked at it for exactly 1 second, not long enough to read it, and then dropped it on the floor of the aisle as casually as he might discard a receipt. "He's not listed," Dominic said, as if this were an observable fact, and not something he had just fabricated with the gesture of dropping a piece of paper. "This isn't his seat." The boarding pass lay on the cream carpet between them. The cabin was very still. Julian looked at the pass on the floor for a moment, then looked at Patricia, who had not moved and who had not said a word about what Dominic had just done. Then, slowly, without any change in his expression, he bent down and picked it up. Careful, unhurried, the way a person picks up something that belongs to them and that they intend to keep. The silence that followed was the kind that tells you everything about a room. Before Julian straightened back up, before Patricia said another word, before the thing that was already in motion could reveal the full shape of itself, 4 people in the cabin had already made separate, private decisions about what they were witnessing and what, if anything, they were going to do about it. In seat 3, B. Noah Park had put his pen to paper before Dominic's hand had finished dropping the boarding pass. Noah was 31 years old, a freelance investigative journalist who had spent the last 2 years writing about inequality in the private aviation industry. Not the loud, visible kind that made headlines, but the quieter, more persistent kind that operated through the accumulation of small decisions that each looked procedurally defensible on its own and added up over time and across hundreds of interactions to something that was neither small nor procedural. He had been on this flight for a story he was researching about complaint resolution patterns in private charter operations. He had not expected the story to board the plane with him. He was writing in a small reporter's notebook with the automatic quality of a man whose body knows how to document before his brain has finished processing what's in front of it. In seat 3. A Dr. Simone Adeyemi had looked up from the brief she'd been reading when Dominic dropped the boarding pass, and she had not looked back down since. She was 44, a human rights attorney who had spent the better part of her career working on cases that were at their core about the same thing. This was about which was the gap between what institutions said they stood for and what they actually did when no one was watching, or as she had learned to understand it when everyone was watching but most had decided not to see. She sat very still with the brief resting on her knee and her attention fully on the aisle, reading the geometry of the situation with the practiced precision of someone who knew exactly what kind of case she was building when she looked at it. In seat 4, a Tyler Walsh had his phone out. He was 27, a marketing analyst who traveled this route monthly for work, and who had until 30 seconds ago been planning to spend the flight catching up on a podcast he'd been meaning to get to. His thumb was hovering over the record button, with the instinct of his generation, the sense that documentation was both obligation and response, that the right answer to witnessing something was to capture it. He had not pressed the button yet, and he wasn't entirely sure why, except that something about the way the man in the aisle was standing still, contained precise, made Tyler feel that whatever this was, it was not yet the moment. He left his thumb where it was and waited. In the last row, Vera Hutchins was 67 years old and had worked in civil rights advocacy since she was 22, which meant she had been doing this for 45 years. And had witnessed across those decades a range of variations on the scene currently unfolding in this aisle that would have been difficult to explain to someone who hadn't seen them. She was white, silver-haired, and she had an expression of careful, deep attention that was not exactly the same as composure, but could look like it from a distance. She was watching Patricia Sloan more than she was watching Julian, because she had learned long ago that the most important thing to observe in these situations was not the person being targeted. They usually knew exactly what was happening, but the person doing the targeting, and specifically the moment when that person realized the room had shifted. That moment had not arrived yet. Julian was still standing in the aisle with the boarding pass back in his hand, and Patricia had not yet spoken again, and the cabin held the particular charged stillness of 4 people who had separately decided to stay alert, to stay present, to stay in the room. Not because they knew who Julian Moore was, not because they had any expectation of being thanked for it, but because something about what they were watching was asking them to be the kind of people who did not look away. Julian looked down the aisle toward the back of the plane, took in all of this, registered it, cataloged it, and then turned back to Patricia. "I'd like to speak with someone from your corporate office," he said quietly. "If you won't verify my seat, I'll need to make a call. If you believe no one should have to fight for a seat they already paid for, if this story is making you feel something already, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button because we're just getting started and the best is still ahead." Patricia Sloan did not invite Julian to make his call. She did something more deliberate than that. She turned to Brenda Osei, who was still standing near the galley with her hands folded in front of her, and her expression doing the complicated work of a person trying to decide what her face should be doing, and said, "Brenda, confirm for me that this passenger is not on today's manifest." It was not a question. It was a directive dressed as a question, which was a different thing entirely, and Brenda seemed to understand this because she reached for the iPad mounted near the galley entrance and looked at it for a moment, and then looked up with her eyes finding some point between Patricia and Julian, rather than either of them directly, and said, "The name isn't showing as confirmed for 2A." Julian looked at her steadily. "What name are you checking?" Brenda blinked. "The manifest shows the seat assigned to..." "What name are you checking?" Julian said again, not louder but more clearly in the tone of a man who has asked a precise question and would like a precise answer. Brenda looked at the iPad again. She scrolled. Something moved across her face, a small flicker of uncertainty, the kind that appears when what you're looking at doesn't match what you've been told you'll see. She started to say something and then stopped. Patricia stepped smoothly into the pause. "Mr. Hale is our confirmed passenger in 2A, she said, addressing the cabin, now rather than Julian specifically, her voice carrying that particular quality of public announcement that is designed to establish a version of events before any competing version can form. "This gentleman does not appear in our system as booked. This is a manifest discrepancy, and I am handling it through proper protocol." Dominic Hale, in the seat that was not his, had the relaxed expression of a man watching a situation play out exactly as he had expected it to. He reached into the inside pocket of his blazer and produced a slim black card, matte embossed, and held it up between 2 fingers, in the lazy way of someone presenting a credential they've never had to explain. "Elite status," he said to no one in particular, and everyone in general. "I've been flying this route since before the acquisition. This seat is mine." Julian looked at the card. He looked at Dominic holding it. Then he looked back at Patricia and said, "I'm going to ask you one more time to verify my booking through your corporate system. Not the manifest on that iPad. The corporate booking system." "My reservation number is..." Sir, Patricia said, and her voice had acquired a new edge. Something that stopped just short of contempt. "You are delaying our departure, and if you continue to be disruptive, I will be required to contact ground security." The word disruptive sat in the air of the cabin with all the weight it carried in that particular context, in that particular aisle, directed at that particular man, a word that was technically neutral, and practically, in this situation, anything but. Noah Park wrote it down in his notebook. In 3A, Dr. Adeyemi exhaled slowly through her nose and set her brief face down on her knee. At 4A, Tyler Walsh's thumb stayed on his phone. Julian reached into his tote and produced his phone. He pressed Diana's name in his contacts and held the phone to his ear, his eyes still on Patricia, his expression still the same. The expression of a man who is doing everything correctly and knows it, and who has enough experience with this particular kind of situation to understand that doing everything correctly is sometimes the most provocative thing you can do. Diana picked up on the second ring. "I'm already watching," she said, which meant she had been following along in some fashion, monitoring the booking system perhaps, or simply knowing Julian well enough to have stayed near her phone this morning. "Pull up the confirmed booking for my seat on this flight," Julian said calmly, as if requesting information about the weather. Done. Seat 2. A confirmed 3 weeks ago corporate booking reference. 7 Alpha 19 issued under your name, time-stamped and fully paid. Diana's voice was crisp and carry-capable, and the phone was not on speaker but was held close enough to Julian's ear at low enough ambient volume that the people nearest him could hear the cadence, if not every word. "Thank you," Julian said. "Please log that the captain of this flight has refused to verify my booking and has publicly characterized me as an unconfirmed passenger without checking the corporate system." "Logged," Diana said. Patricia's jaw moved slightly. Not speaking, just adjusting. "You are not authorized to record." "I'm not recording," Julian said. "I'm logging. There's a difference." Brenda Osei, standing behind Patricia with the iPad still in her hands, looked down at the screen again, and this time she did not look up for a long moment, and when she finally did, something in her face had changed, not dramatically, not visibly enough for everyone to notice, but enough for Julian to notice, and for Noah Park in 3B to notice, because they were both people who had learned to watch for exactly that kind of change. Julian slid his phone into his shirt pocket and stood with his boarding pass in one hand and his scarf draped over the other arm, waiting. What Patricia did next was the decision that changed everything, though it would not be recognized as such until later. And when it was, it would be understood as the precise moment when a situation that might have been resolved quietly became one that could not. She turned to face the cabin. Not Julian the cabin. Every seated passenger, every available pair of eyes and ears, the full audience of people who had been watching this quietly, and whom she now addressed in the carrying voice of someone who had decided that the best defense was the loudest narrative. "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to assure you that we are working to resolve a boarding irregularity as quickly as possible. An individual without confirmed manifest status is attempting to occupy a taken seat, and our crew is following standard protocol to ensure your safety and comfort are not compromised." She said this calmly. She said it with the fluent ease of someone who has given the impression of following procedure so many times that the impression has become indistinguishable from the thing itself. And she said it while standing half-turned toward Julian, which meant that every person in the cabin who heard the word individual, and heard the word irregularity, and heard the word attempting, was also looking at the black man standing in the aisle with the linen blazer over his arm, and the announcement had done its work before he said a single word in response. Noah Park stopped writing and looked up not to observe Julian, but to observe the passengers' faces, which was the more instructive thing to look at. Dominic had refamiliarized himself with his phone content now to let the announcement do what it was doing. But he reached into his blazer pocket and produced the black card again and set it on the armrest of 2A visible in exhibit. "That's what genuine elite status looks like," he said pleasantly to no one in particular, and again, everyone in general. From 3B. Noah Park leaned forward slightly and looked at the card. He said nothing yet, but his pen moved. Patricia turned back to Julian. "If you'd like to take a seat in the rear of the cabin while we work through the documentation issue, I can have Brenda assist you." "I have a confirmed seat in 2A," Julian said. "I'll wait here." "That's not." "Captain," Julian said, and his voice was so measured and so clear that it created a different quality of silence than the one that had existed a moment before. "I want to understand something. In the past 8 minutes, you have declined to check my boarding pass, declined to check the corporate booking system, and made a public announcement characterizing me as unconfirmed without completing a single verification step." Can you explain what protocol you are actually following?" Patricia's expression did not change, but the temperature behind it did. "First Officer Rafferty," she said, not looking away from Julian. "Please, log a manifest irregularity for seat 2A, and note that the passenger has refused to take an alternate seat." At the cockpit door, James Rafferty, 40, careful-eyed, the look of a man who has learned to be very good at not being in the middle of things, hesitated. He held a tablet in one hand and looked at it the way people look at objects when they're not actually seeing them, but need something to look at. Then he typed something. "With respect, Dr. Adeyemi said from 3A, and her voice was the kind of voice that arrives in a room and rearranges it slightly just by being there, measured, accustomed to being heard, carrying the particular authority of someone who has spent 20 years speaking in rooms where the stakes were real. The captain has not completed a single verification of this passenger's documentation. Logging an irregularity on that basis would not hold up." Patricia turned toward her. "Ma'am, this is a crew matter. I'm aware of what it is, Doctor," Adeyemi said, without rising from her seat, without any particular heat, just with the steady, grounded certainty of someone who knows exactly what they're looking at. Tyler Walsh had his phone raised again. Dr. Adeyemi glanced at him not sternly, but with a clear and specific look, and said quietly, "Not yet. Let's hear what she says." Tyler held the phone but didn't press record. Julian, watching all of this, the way the cabin was slowly reorganizing itself, the way the passengers were beginning to make quiet individual decisions about which direction they were facing, felt something clarify inside him. Not anger, though there was something underneath that could become anger if he allowed it. Something quieter than anger and more durable. The recognition that this was not improvised. The log change Rafferty had just entered, the announcement Patricia had made, the way Dominic's card had appeared at exactly the right moment, these were not the actions of people responding to a situation. These were the actions of people executing a familiar sequence. He had read about this sequence in 34 complaint reports. He was standing inside it now. He called Diana again. "Log that the first officer has entered a manifest irregularity at the captain's direction without documentation review," he said, "and pull the last 12 months of complaints filed on this route." "Already on it," Diana said. "Julian, there are 17 complaints on this specific route. Most of them are, I know what they are," he said. "Keep listening." He put the phone back in his pocket and looked at Patricia with an expression that was not confrontational and not defeated, the expression of a man who understands that the situation is not what it appears to be, and who has decided that the truth, given enough time and the right witnesses, will eventually surface on its own. Noah Park had a habit developed over years of reporting, of looking at the things at the edges of scenes rather than the things at the center, because the center was usually what everyone was watching, and the edges were where the actual information lived. This was how, while the rest of the cabin's attention was focused on the conversation in the aisle between Julian and Patricia, he noticed the notebook. It was tucked into the side pocket of the overhead storage compartment built into the wall behind the galley. Not the standard compartment, but the narrower one used for crew documentation that was technically accessible to cabin crew, and in this configuration of the G650 partially visible from 3B when the galley partition was folded back. A small leather-bound thing, dark brown, with a tab marker visible on one of its internal sections, the kind of notebook that suggested someone used it regularly and with purpose. Noah did not move toward it. He looked at it for a few seconds, noted its position relative to Brenda's station, noted the way Brenda had glanced at it once in the last few minutes without appearing to mean to, and then wrote 2 words in his own notebook and underlined them, "Private log." In the aisle, the situation had not resolved. Patricia had not checked the corporate system. Brenda was still standing with the iPad, which she had not lowered and which she had not referred to since Julian had asked about his booking number, which was itself a kind of answer that she might not have intended to give. Patricia said, "I've asked you twice to wait in the rear while we clarify this, and you've declined twice. I'm not going to ask a third time." "Then don't ask," Julian said. "Verify my booking," Brenda Patricia said. And there was something in her tone now, a particular sharpness that was not audible to everyone in the cabin, but that Brenda clearly heard and responded to physically, her shoulders moving in a small, involuntary way that was not quite a flinch, and not quite anything else. "Call ground security and request assistance with an uncooperative passenger." Brenda's hands were not entirely steady on the handset she picked up. She looked at Julian while she dialed, and Julian looked back at her, and his expression was not accusatory and not pleading. It was simply open the way you look at someone when you're giving them room to make a different choice than the one they're moving toward. "I'm not asking you to disobey your captain," he said quietly enough that it was not a public statement, just a sentence between two people. "I'm asking you to tell the truth." Brenda held the handset. The dial tone was audible in the near silence of the cabin. She didn't complete the call. She set the handset down on its cradle, and she looked at the floor, and she said nothing, and the not saying was as clear as any statement she could have made. From the back row, Vera Hutchins spoke for the first time. She didn't stand. She didn't raise her voice. She simply said to no one in particular, and in the tone of someone observing a pattern they've observed before, "I've seen this before. And I've seen how it ends." Patricia's head turned toward the back row with a sharp efficiency that revealed more clearly than anything she'd said in the last 15 minutes that she was not as unbothered by her audience as she was pretending to be. She looked at Vera, at this silver-haired woman sitting in the last row with her hands folded in her lap, looking back at Patricia with the patient attention of someone who has exactly nothing to fear from the gaze being directed at them. And she held that look for a moment, and then she turned away. And in that turning away, in that decision to dismiss rather than engage, to categorize and move on, something about Patricia Sloane became legible that all her correct procedure and careful language had been obscuring. It was not the decision of someone who was confident that the facts were on her side. It was the decision of someone who had built a practice around not needing facts to be on her side, and who was continuing that practice now out of habit, because it had always worked before, and because the notion that it might not work this time was not yet one she was prepared to entertain. Julian watched this too. He had built 20 years of his career on his ability to read rooms on the particular form of attention his grandfather had taught him, the observation that arrived from the margins rather than the center that noticed what people did with their bodies when they thought they were only talking with their mouths. He had read this room very clearly, and what he read told him that the thing that needed to happen next was not another statement or another request. What needed to happen was for the truth to have somewhere to come from. He looked at Noah Park, who was already watching him, and gave him a small, specific nod. The nod of one careful observer acknowledging another, and waited. Noah Park stood up. He did it without announcing himself, without the performative quality of someone about to make a statement, just a man rising from his seat because he had something to say, and standing was the clearest way to say it. "That card," he said, addressing Patricia, but looking at Dominic, "is not a valid format." Dominic looked up from his phone with the expression of a man who has just been addressed by someone he considers beneath the necessity of response. "I beg your pardon. The elite status credential for Apex Airlux has used a new embossing format for the past 14 months, Noah said in the even detailed tone of a person recounting facts they have no reason to exaggerate because the facts are interesting enough on their own. The font on the tier designation changed. The hologram placement moved from the lower right to the upper left. The card you're holding uses the old format, which was discontinued when the new ownership took over the operation. I've reported on this specific change. I can tell you the date if it would be helpful." The cabin was very quiet. Dominic's expression went through several things in quick succession: surprise, recalibration, and then a settling into the particular coldness of someone deciding that the best response to being caught is to behave as though the catching hasn't occurred. "Who exactly are you?" he said. "Someone who reads carefully," Noah said, and sat back down. Patricia was still looking at Dominic, and whatever she was calculating behind her expression, she had not found a way to make it show in her face yet. But Brenda Osei, standing behind her, looked at the card on Dominic's armrest, with her brow slightly contracted, and then looked at the iPad in her hands, and something in her posture shifted by a few degrees. "This is irrelevant," Patricia said, and her voice had recovered most of its authority, but had lost a quality that was harder to name, the fluency. Maybe the sense that the script she was working from had been written for exactly this situation. "Mr. Hale is a verified. He's been flying this route for a year under a credential that hasn't been valid for 14 months, Dr. Adeyemi said, from 3. A still seated, still without any particular heat, just with the steady factual quality of someone for whom stating the obvious is a professional competency. If the verification system hasn't flagged that, then the system has a problem." Dominic turned toward her now, and his voice had acquired an edge that was less about her specifically than about the fact of being questioned by people he had not anticipated would question him. "I don't know who you are, but this is a private discussion between myself and the crew, and I'd suggest you stay out of it." "I'm a passenger on this flight," Dr. Adeyemi said pleasantly, "which means I'm part of any discussion about who belongs in this cabin." In 4A, Tyler Walsh had raised his phone again, and Dr. Adeyemi didn't stop him this time. She simply said without looking at him, "If you're going to film everything, don't start from now." Tyler understood what she meant, that partial documentation was worse than none, and kept the phone raised but did not begin recording quite yet, waiting for the moment that would make the context complete. Julian was watching Dominic, and what he was watching was the specific quality of Dominic's confidence as it was subjected to the friction of people who were not operating on his terms. For 41 flights, Dominic Hale had existed in this cabin as someone whose status was simply accepted. Never questioned, never verified the way Julian's had been questioned and unverified in the last 20 minutes. The asymmetry was not incidental. It was the mechanism. And then Dominic looked at Patricia. A brief specific look, the kind that passes between people who have an understanding, and said, quietly but audibly enough for the nearest passengers, "Can we just get him off the plane?" Not a question, a request. The request of a man who is accustomed to things being arranged. Patricia straightened, reached for the intercom, and said, "I'm going to need security to assist with a boarding dispute in the first-class cabin." Vera Hutchins from the back row said in the same unhurried tone as before, "Go ahead and try." The security officer who came through the boarding door 3 minutes later was a man named Carl Briggs, solidly built mid-40s, a contractor who provided ground security services to several private charter operations at O'Hare, and who had been doing this long enough to walk into a tense situation with the practiced calm of someone who has walked into many of them, and who has also in that time developed a set of instincts about how to read the people in them that were not always wrong, but were not always right either. He assessed the cabin the way his training had taught him to, quickly, systematically looking for the obvious indicators of disruption, and his assessment took him to Julian Moore standing in the aisle with a boarding pass in one hand and a phone in his shirt pocket, because Julian was the only person who was standing, and who was therefore, by the logic of the assessment, the problem. Sir Carl said, and the deliberate absence of any title or courtesy prefix was its own kind of statement, "You've been asked to either take an alternate seat or exit the aircraft. I'm going to need you to comply with one of those options." "I have a confirmed booking for 2A," Julian said. "I'd like someone to verify it through the corporate system." "That's a crew matter," Carl said. "Right now what I need is for you to come with me." He reached forward and placed his hand on Julian's shoulder. Not roughly, but firmly, the hand of a man who has decided that the conversation is over and that what comes next is physical compliance. The cabin reacted before Julian did. Dr. Adeyemi was on her feet. "Remove your hand," she said, and her voice in this moment was not the composed, measured instrument it had been for the previous 20 minutes. It was the voice of someone for whom a line has been crossed and who is not interested in qualifying how she feels about that. He has not done anything that warrants physical contact, and you have not established any legal basis for removal. Tyler Walsh pressed record. This time, no one stopped him. "This is racial profiling," Tyler said, his voice cracking slightly on the first word, and then finding its footing. "I'm saying it out loud because someone needs to, and it's happening right now in broad daylight in front of all of us." Carl's hand was still on Julian's shoulder. He looked at Dr. Adeyemi, then at Tyler's phone, then at the row of faces Noah's pen, Vera's stillness, Brenda's hands gripping the galley counter, and he was a man who understood in this moment that the room had stopped being what he had walked into it expecting to be. Julian had not moved. He had not attempted to remove Carl's hand, had not raised his voice, had not done anything that would have given the situation the shape that Carl's arrival had been intended to give it. He simply stood with the scarf sliding off his arm to the floor as Carl's grip tightened slightly with the boarding pass still held in his other hand, with an expression that was not anger and was not fear and was not anything that the room could mistake for instability or disruption. It was the expression of a man who has been here before in this exact shape of situation, who has felt this exact quality of wrongness and has learned through long and costly experience that the worst thing you can do when someone is trying to make you into a problem is to become one, and who has, in the space of one quiet breath, decided what comes next. He reached into his shirt pocket and took out his phone. "Diana," he said. And his voice was so calm in that cabin against the backdrop of Carl's hand on his shoulder, and Patricia's silence and Dominic's satisfaction, and Brenda's shame, that it created a kind of stillness in the way that a single note sometimes creates stillness, not by being quiet, but by being exactly itself. "Begin corporate identification protocol." Diana's response was immediate. "Yes, sir." Identity confirmation initiated. Carl's hand on Julian's shoulder went very still. Patricia Sloane's face, for the first time in the 40 minutes since Julian had boarded, did something it had not done before. It lost its certainty. What happened next happened in the space of about 90 seconds, but it had the quality of events that seem longer than they are, because each component of them lands with its own weight, and the mind needs a moment to absorb each one before the next arrives. Diana Cole's voice came through the phone clearly enough for the nearest passengers to hear her, and she read aloud, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the precise, clean delivery of someone who has spent 11 years ensuring that things are documented correctly and who understands that documentation in the right moment is its own form of authority. She read the booking confirmation number. She read the timestamp 3 weeks prior, 6:47 in the morning, which was the time Julian had made the reservation himself while sitting at his desk before the building's other occupants arrived. She read the corporate reference number, the seat assignment, the passenger name, and the issuing entity, which was Apex Ventures' own executive travel portal, the same system that every crew member on this aircraft had access to, and that any one of them could have checked at any point in the preceding 40 minutes. Carl Briggs' hand left Julian's shoulder. It was not a dramatic removal. It was not accompanied by any statement or gesture of acknowledgement. It was simply the quiet physical retreat of a man recalibrating his understanding of a situation in real time, stepping back 2 inches in the way that bodies do when the ground has shifted beneath them and they need to find new footing. Patricia said, "That proves nothing." "Documents can be," Captain Sloane Julian said, and the use of her full title was deliberate, carrying the specific weight of someone addressing a person who is about to be held to the responsibilities of a position they've been claiming without meeting Diana, is speaking from our corporate system in real time. If you have a different version of reality that you'd like to present, I'm listening. Patricia did not present a different version. She stood with her hands at her sides and her expression doing the maintenance work of a person who has committed to a position and is discovering incrementally that the position was built on something that is not going to hold. Brenda Osei took a half step back from Patricia's shoulder. It was small, barely perceptible, but in the rearranged geography of the cabin, it was visible to everyone who was watching, which at this point was everyone. The half step said, "I am no longer standing next to her. I am standing somewhere else now. Doctor." Adeyemi, still on her feet, looked at Brenda with the practiced assessment of someone reading a witness's body language, and what she read made her sit down slowly, without looking away. Noah Park's pen had not stopped moving. Tyler Walsh had lowered his phone from filming position, but held it at his side, still recording audio, because some instinct told him that what was coming was going to be more significant than what had already happened, and that it was going to be spoken rather than visible, Diana Julian said, still in the same composed register. The register of a man who has decided exactly how much of himself this situation is going to cost, and has paid that price already and is operating from the other side of it. "I need you to log that. The captain declined to verify my booking through the corporate system for approximately 40 minutes while I was standing in the aisle, and that this failure to verify occurred despite a confirmed booking, a valid boarding pass, and 3 explicit requests for documentation review." "Logged," Diana said, and then added after a pause that was itself communicative. "Julian, there's something else. The manifest was accessed at 11:47 last night. There was a modification made to the confirmed passenger list for seat 2A. The cabin absorbed this." "Who accessed it?" Julian asked. Diana gave him the answer quietly. He did not repeat it to the cabin. He simply looked up and found James Rafferty in the cockpit doorway where the first officer had been standing for the last 10 minutes with the expression of a man watching something he had hoped would not happen, and who was now deciding second by second what he was going to do about the fact that it had. "Mr. Rafferty," Julian said. He said it without heat, without volume, just as a statement of a name that carried everything necessary within it. Rafferty did not move. Julian let the silence stand for a full count of 3. And then he looked toward the galley storage compartment, specifically at the wall panel in the narrow section that Noah had been looking at intermittently since the second chapter of this morning had begun, and he said to Brenda, "There's a notebook in the side compartment behind the galley partition. I'd like you to bring it here." Brenda's head came up. Patricia said, "That is private operational documentation, and it is not available to passengers." Julian looked at her for a moment without speaking. Then he said very quietly, "Then you won't mind explaining what's in it?" Brenda didn't move for a long moment. She stood between the galley counter and the aisle with her hands at her sides and the iPad still in one hand, and the expression of someone who is standing at the exact point where 2 different versions of her own life diverge and who knows it and who is not yet sure which direction her body is going to take her. Patricia's voice arrived from her left, Brenda. One word, a name. But in the way it was spoken, the inflection, the certainty, the assumption of obedience built into the single syllable, it carried the weight of a history between them that the rest of the cabin was only beginning to understand the shape of. Brenda looked at Patricia. Then she looked at Julian. Then she looked at the wall panel where the notebook was, the way a person looks at the thing they've been pretending not to notice and can no longer pretend about. Noah Park stood up from 3B and said, "I can see it from here. Side panel folded back, there's a leather-bound notebook in the crew storage compartment. I've been looking at it for the last half hour." He said it calmly as a statement of observable fact, and then he added, "I haven't touched it. I'm just telling you it's there, and that Brenda knows it's there, and I think everyone here would like to know what's in it." Brenda closed her eyes for a moment, the closing that isn't exhaustion but decision. And then she walked to the panel, opened it, and took out the notebook. It was dark brown leather, small enough to fit in a coat pocket with a tab marker extending from one of its middle sections. It had the worn quality of something used regularly and consistently over a long period of time. Brenda held it in both hands for a second, and then she walked to Julian and held it out to him. Patricia said, That is, I know what it is, Brenda said, and her voice was very quiet, and it was the first time since boarding that she had spoken without the overlay of someone else's script, and the difference was audible. I've known for a long time. Julian took the notebook. He opened it at the first page, read the first entry silently, and then passed it without comment to Dr. Adeyemi. Dr. Adeyemi took it the way lawyers take documents they're about to read into a record with both hands, sitting forward with the kind of focused attention that signals that what she's reading is going to matter. She read the first entry, then the second. Then she looked up at the cabin and began to read aloud in the measured, unhurried voice of a woman who has read evidence into a record many times and understands that the most effective thing is simply to let the words be heard. March 14th, she said. Seat 2B, black male 35 to 40 business casual dress, does not present as confirmed class tier. Flag for additional documentation check. She paused. April 2nd. Seat 3A, black woman, well-dressed designer luggage. Booking query, confirm origin of reservation. Note vocal about expectations. Monitor. She turned the page. April 19th, mixed-race couple, 4A and 4B. Elevated conversation seemed to expect premium service without demonstration of status. Request crew review before meal service. The cabin had gone entirely completely still. Noah Park was not writing. He was listening in the way you listen when you want to be certain you have heard something correctly because you are going to need to repeat it exactly and you cannot afford to get it wrong. Tyler Walsh's phone was recording. No one said anything about it. There are more, Dr. Adeyemi said. Quite a few more. She turned to a tabbed section and looked at it without reading aloud for a moment. There's a column here, she said, and her voice had acquired a new quality. Not anger, but the particular gravity that arrives when something you already knew is confirmed in writing in someone's own hand, in terms that can no longer be explained away. 2 columns, actually. One is labeled flagged. The other is labeled confirmed standing. She looked up. She looked at Dominic Hale. Mr. Hale, she said your name is in the second column. It's starred. Dominic said nothing. The names in the first column, Dr. Adeyemi continued still holding the notebook open, are predominantly, I would say exclusively, from what I can see, passengers of color. The names in the second column are not. The silence that followed was not the silence of shock. It was the silence of recognition, which is a different thing, heavier and less temporary, because shock passes and recognition doesn't. Patricia Sloane had not moved and had not spoken since Brenda walked to the panel. She stood near the cockpit door with her arms at her sides and her expression doing something that it had not done at any previous point in the morning, which was to stop performing entirely to simply exist in the cabin with the rest of them, and to accept in that stillness what the stillness meant. Julian looked at her. He looked at her for a long time without speaking. Noah Park said from his seat quietly, "This isn't a log, it's a system." He paused. "It's a record of how this cabin has been run for how long?" He looked at the first page of the notebook where a date was printed at the top of the first entry. 2 years and 4 months, he said. Julian took his phone out and held it so that Diana could see through the camera what Dr. Adeyemi was holding open. "Diana," he said, "you're seeing this." "Every page," Diana said, and her voice was very quiet in the way that voices get when the thing they're hearing has gone past surprise into something more serious. "Julian, every page." "Good," Julian said. He did not look away from Patricia. "Because it's going to matter." With the notebook open in Dr. Adeyemi's hands and 2 years and 4 months of a private sorting system laid out before the cabin in Patricia Sloane's own handwriting, the morning reached the moment that Brenda Osei had been living inside for the better part of a year without knowing how to get to the other side of it. She started to speak, and what came out first was not a sentence, but the kind of breath that precedes sentences that have been held back for a long time. The breath of someone who has been deciding whether to say a thing for so long that the deciding has become its own form of suffering, and who has arrived at last at the end of it. Before this flight, she said, addressing Julian, but aware of the cabin, I was given a list of names. Patricia said Brenda, and Brenda looked at her, and something in that look made Patricia stop. A list of names Brenda continued to deprioritize on the manifest. It's not the first time. It's happened on several flights. The instruction was always framed as routine manifest management booking adjustments, capacity balancing, but the names on the list were always the same kind of names. And your name, she said to Julian, was on the list that came through last night. The cabin received this. The list comes from the captain, Dr. Adeyemi asked, and her voice had the precise, careful quality of a person asking a question they already know the answer to and need stated on the record. Yes, Brenda said. It always comes from the captain. She reached into her jacket and produced her personal phone. Last month, I was asked to make an adjustment on a different flight to remove a name from a confirmed booking. It wasn't the first time, but it was the first time I kept the message it came in on. She held up the phone. The screen showed a message thread. I also kept the receipt for the payment that came with the request. It was deposited through a third-party account, but the corporate travel account it originated from. She paused. Looking at Dominic Hale for a moment isn't hard to trace. Dominic had been sitting very still for the past several minutes in the manner of someone who has been watching the walls of a room they're occupying develop cracks and who is calculating with increasing urgency the structural implications. At Brenda's look, something in his posture changed a fraction of an inch barely visible, but the visible fraction of something much larger. Patricia's voice had changed too. It was quieter now and harder, the voice of someone who has discovered that composure is not the same as safety and is deciding whether to acknowledge the difference. You are making an accusation you have no basis for, she said, but the sentence had lost the quality that had characterized all her earlier statements, which was the quality of someone who believes they're right. This sentence had the quality of someone who knows they're not. Julian looked at Brenda. He looked at her with the full direct attention of a man seeing a person clearly, not just the thing they'd done wrong, not just the thing they'd finally done right, but both of those things together with the space in between them. Thank you for saying it now, he said. The gentleness of it was unexpected. Not forgiveness. He was precise about that in himself. Understanding that forgiveness was something that would require more time and a different kind of conversation, but something adjacent to it, something that acknowledged the weight of what it had taken to say the thing she'd just said, and did not pretend that weight was nothing. Brenda looked at the floor for a moment. She was not crying, but she looked like someone who has been holding something heavy for a long time and has just set it down and is not yet sure how to stand without the weight of it. Dr. Adeyemi placed a hand briefly on Brenda's arm, not absolution and not consolation exactly, but the specific human acknowledgement that she was a person in a hard moment, and that the people in the cabin saw that, and that being seen in a hard moment was not nothing. Patricia had stopped speaking. It was the first time since Julian had boarded that Patricia Sloane had completely stopped speaking, and the silence she left was more communicative than anything she had said in the preceding hour, because it was the silence of someone who has run out of the particular kind of confidence that doesn't come from being right, but from never having been forced to prove it, and who has discovered in the moment of running out exactly how much of their authority was always contingent on everyone else's compliance. Carl Briggs, standing now at the edge of the cabin near the boarding door, looked at his own hands. James Rafferty had been in the cockpit doorway for the better part of an hour, and in that time he had occupied a particular and uncomfortable position that could be described in architectural terms as a threshold. Standing neither inside the cabin nor outside it, neither fully implicated nor fully uninvolved. The posture of a man who has made the calculation that remaining in the middle is the safest place to be, and who is now watching that calculation prove itself wrong in real time. Julian turned to him. He didn't need to say anything beyond his name. Mr. Rafferty. Rafferty was holding his tablet in both hands the way people hold things when their hands need something to do, but their minds are somewhere else entirely. He looked at Julian. He looked at Brenda, who had just spoken the hardest sentence of her professional life and was still standing, still present, still in the room. He looked at the notebook Dr. Adeyemi was still holding, and he looked at Patricia, who was not looking at anyone and whose silence had the quality of a door that has been closed and locked and is not going to open again from the inside. "Did you alter the manifest?" Julian asked. He asked it the way you ask someone a question whose answer you already know, but which needs to be asked anyway because asking it is the only way the answer can officially exist. Rafferty's first response was to look at his tablet, which was not an answer, and was also an answer. "Mr. Rafferty," Julian said again, and his voice had the steady quality of a metronome, not pressing, not threatening, just marking time, with the expectation that the time was going to lead somewhere. "I flagged your profile," Rafferty said. The sentence came out slightly ahead of whatever decision had been building toward it, which was how confessions usually arrived, not at the moment of full resolve, but at the moment when the cost of continuing the alternative finally exceeded the cost of telling the truth. "Last night, at Captain Sloane's direction." It was framed as routine manifest management, a booking discrepancy that needed to be flagged before the flight. I was told the passenger had been flagged before for irregular booking activity. He paused. "I didn't know whose name it was when I made the change. When I found out this morning, when I saw who was standing in the aisle, I said nothing. I let the situation continue." He stopped again. "That was wrong." Julian looked at him for a long moment before speaking. "Saying nothing when you know is not neutrality," he said. "It's a choice." "Yes," Rafferty said. "I know." The response was simple enough to be believed. It didn't dress itself up in qualification or context or the language of extenuating circumstances, and that simplicity was its own form of honesty. The honesty of someone who has stopped trying to manage how the truth lands and has just let it land. Noah Park set down his pen for a moment and looked at Rafferty with the particular attention of someone who writes about human behavior for a living and is observing something they will think about for a while. Carl Briggs had moved incrementally toward the boarding door, not leaving, not yet, but repositioning the way a person repositions when they're recalculating their relationship to a situation, and the recalculation is not going in the direction they'd hoped. He was no longer standing in alignment with Patricia. He was standing near the door, and the nearness to the door was communicative. Dominic Hale had put his phone face down on the armrest of 2A. He had not spoken for several minutes. He was a man who had been accustomed across a long career and a comfortable life to operating from a position where the weight of the room's assumptions was on his side, and where that weight did the work, so he didn't have to, and he was now sitting very still in a room where that weight had quietly and irreversibly redistributed itself. Diana's voice came through the phone Julian was still holding. "Corporate has everything logged. Internal legal has been notified and is reviewing the manifest modification record, the notebook documentation, and the payment trace. You are fully authorized to proceed, Mr. Moore." Julian said. "One more moment." He turned to look at Dominic Hale. He had been saving this turn for last, not out of strategy exactly, but out of the sense that the other truths needed to be established first, so that when the last truth arrived, it arrived with the full weight of everything that had come before it. "Mr. Hale," he said. Dominic Hale looked up from the armrest where his phone was sitting face down, and his forged card was still sitting face up, and he looked at Julian with the expression of a man who has been in enough rooms across enough decades to understand that the geography of the room has shifted against him, and who is deciding in the moment whether to acknowledge it or not? He decided not to. "Whatever she told you about me," Dominic said with a gesture toward Brenda that managed to be dismissive and accusatory simultaneously. "I want you to understand that I've been flying this route for I'm going to ask Noah to describe the card," Julian said. Dominic stopped speaking. He looked at Noah Park, who was already standing because Noah had understood from Julian's look to him a moment earlier that this was where his particular form of knowledge was going to be useful, and he had been waiting for the invitation with the patience of a man who has learned that the best moments in journalism often come to people willing to wait for them. Noah looked at the card on the armrest of 2A. He described it the way he had described it before, but this time with more detail and more deliberateness in the full hearing of every person in the cabin. The embossing format, the old font, the hologram in the wrong position, the credential structure that Apex Air Lux had retired when the new ownership had replaced the verification architecture 14 months ago. He cited from memory the date of the changeover and the trade publication where he had first reported on the transition. He sat back down. Julian looked at Dominic. "Diana," he said, and didn't look away from Dominic while he spoke. "Pull up Dominic Hale's elite status record in the Apex system." Diana's response came after a brief pause. Dominic Hale's elite status was revoked 9 months ago following a formal passenger complaint filed against him. The complaint was marked "reviewed and closed" in the system with no further action documented. His credential has not been valid since the revocation. The cabin received this the way cabins receive information that confirms what they've already begun to understand, not with surprise but with the particular weighted silence of people who have been watching a picture resolve and who are now looking at what it shows. "The complaint that was filed against him," Julian said. "I can read the summary," Diana said. "Please." She did. It described a flight 9 months prior on this route. It described a black passenger in the seat beside Dominic Hale who had been subjected to repeated questions about the legitimacy of his booking first from Dominic, then after Dominic had spoken with a crew member in the galley from the flight attendant as well. The passenger had his documentation, had produced it had been grudgingly permitted to remain in his seat, and had afterward filed a formal complaint that had been received by the Apex complaint system logged and never addressed. The passenger's name in the complaint was not Julian Moore. It was just a name. A man who had been on a flight had been treated badly, had done the correct and trusting thing of filing a formal report, and had never heard anything back and had probably, Julian thought about this, allowed himself to think about it. Probably understood somewhere in his body, even without explicit confirmation, that the silence was its own kind of answer. "You forged your credentials," Julian said to Dominic. "You took a seat that wasn't yours, and when someone appeared who might have challenged that, when I walked through that door, you used your history with this crew and your position in this cabin to make sure I was treated as the problem rather than you." He paused. "That is not a mistake. That is a pattern. A pattern that involved at least one formal complaint that was never investigated, a manifest that was altered on your behalf, and a crew that had been trained by what I'm looking at in that notebook to ensure that your experience in this cabin was never disrupted by the presence of people who didn't fit the picture you were comfortable with." Dominic opened his mouth. Julian held up one hand. Not aggressively, just with the simple authority of someone who has finished making their case and is not interested in a rebuttal. Dominic closed his mouth. Tyler Walsh from 4A said quietly but clearly, "There it is." And the cabin in its entirety agreed. Julian Moore reached up and fastened the single button on his linen blazer with the unhurried deliberateness of a man choosing to be fully present in a room that has up to this point been trying to remove him from it. It was a small gesture. Anyone watching might not have registered it consciously, but it had the quality of a man stepping into something, settling into himself the way water settles into its actual level after something has disturbed its surface. He turned to face the cabin. Not Patricia, not Dominic, Not Rafferty or Brenda or Carl. The whole cabin, all of them. Everyone who had been in this space for the past hour, and who had watched what had unfolded, and who had made their own individual decisions at different moments about what to do with what they were seeing. He looked at them all, and he did not look like a man who has won something. He looked like a man who has arrived at a place he's been walking toward for a long time and is now standing in it. "My name is Julian Moore," he said, and his voice was clear and steady and entirely without performance. The voice of a man stating a fact that has been in his possession all along and that he is choosing now to share. "I am the founder and CEO of Apex Ventures, Apex Airlux. This aircraft, its routes, its ground operations, its crew contracts, every component of the operation you have been traveling on today is mine. All of it falls under my authority. I own it." The sentence landed in the cabin the way a large, solid object lands, not gradually, not with the rippling expansion of something light, but with the immediate definite impact of something with real weight. Dominic's hand closed around the armrest of seat 2A. He did not stand. He sat very still with his fingers gripping the leather in the way that hands grip things when the brain has sent an emergency signal and the body hasn't yet determined what to do with it. Brenda closed her eyes. When she opened them, she was looking at the floor, and the expression on her face was not the shame of someone who has been caught, but the different and more complicated expression of someone who has been carrying something heavy for a long time and has just understood the full weight of what they've been carrying. Rafferty lowered his head. He did not look up for a long moment, and when he did, he was looking at his own hands, which was its own kind of inventory. Carl Briggs near the boarding door had already positioned himself in the unmistakable posture of someone who has separated himself from a decision he made on the wrong side of a situation and is hoping that the separation is being observed. Patricia Sloane did not crumble. She held herself very upright, the rigidity of discipline persisting past the moment when discipline is useful, and she was still and pale and looking at Julian with an expression that was no longer authority and was not quite anything else, yet still in the process of becoming whatever it was going to be. And then there were the others. Dr. Adeyemi nodded once, a single contained movement that was not surprise and not vindication, but something more like, "Yes, this is what I thought was happening," and the fact that it's confirmed changes things. She was already thinking about the next steps. She was constitutionally incapable of not thinking about the next steps, but she let herself sit with the moment for a few seconds before moving there. Noah Park stopped writing. For the first time since he'd boarded, his pen was completely still because some things don't need to be written down to be documented. Some things document themselves in the memory of everyone present, and this was one of them. He looked at Julian, and then he looked at the cabin, and then he looked at the notebook in Dr. Adeyemi's hands, and he understood that what he was going to write about this morning was going to take a while to get right, because the full shape of it was still forming. Tyler Walsh lowered his phone to his lap. He had been filming, and now he stopped, not because the moment didn't merit recording, but because the recording felt suddenly secondary to the act of simply being here and witnessing it in the way that humans witness things, which is with the full, unreliable, imperfect apparatus of the body and the memory and the feeling, all of it together, none of it edited. Vera Hutchins, from the last row, uncrossed her hands in her lap. She had been sitting with her hands folded throughout a posture of watchful patience of someone who has learned to conserve energy for the moments that actually require it, and the uncrossing was small, but visible, a release, the physical expression of something loosening that had been held tight for a long time. Julian looked at all of this. He took it in, all of them, and he held it for a moment, and then he said what needed to be said next, which was not triumph and was not anger and was not performance. This aircraft, he said, was built on the promise of dignity. That promise was violated here today in this cabin by the people whose responsibility it was to keep it, and it is my responsibility to make certain that it does not happen again. He looked at Patricia. "This ends now." He addressed each of them in order, and the order was deliberate. It moved from the highest authority to the most recent arrival, from the person who had built the pattern to the person who had most recently enforced it. And in each case, the dismissal was specific and grounded in what had actually occurred, rather than in generalization, because Julian understood that generalization was how accountability got diluted, and he was not interested in diluted accountability this morning. "Captain Patricia Sloane," he said, and he used her full name and rank not as a formality, but as a precise identification of the position she was being removed from, so that the removal could not be misunderstood as anything other than what it was. "You are dismissed effective immediately from your role as captain of this aircraft, and from your service with Apex Air Lux." He did not pause for her response, but he was not rushing either. He spoke at the pace of someone who has thought about what they're saying and intends each word. "You declined to verify my booking for nearly an hour while publicly characterizing me as an intruder in my own aircraft. You maintained a private passenger log for more than 2 years that identified passengers by race and categorized them according to your personal determination of whether they belonged in this cabin. You directed your crew to alter the manifest to prevent my boarding, and you called security to physically remove me rather than perform a single verification step that would have resolved the situation in 30 seconds. You did not fail because you made a mistake, Captain Sloane. You failed because you built something piece by piece over time embedded in the operation of this airline that was designed to make certain people feel like they did not belong here. That is not a management failure. That is a choice made repeatedly, and it ends today." Patricia received this without response. Her face had the quality of a closed door. James Rafferty, Julian, continued, turning to the first officer. "You are dismissed from your role as first officer effective immediately. You altered the manifest at the captain's direction, knowing that the instruction was irregular, and when you discovered the identity of the name you had moved, you chose silence. I acknowledge that you told the truth when it became unavoidable, but telling the truth when there is no other option is not the same as integrity. And what this crew required this morning was integrity before it became unavoidable." He paused for a moment, not for effect, but because he meant what he was about to say and wanted it to arrive at its full weight. "I hope you understand the difference, because understanding it is the only thing that will make you useful in the next situation you're standing in." Rafferty looked up. He nodded a single genuine movement and then looked back at his own hands. Julian turned to Brenda. He was quiet for a moment, standing in front of her, and the quiet had a different texture than the quiet with the others. It was not the pause before a verdict, but the pause of someone sorting something that is genuinely not simple. "Brenda Osei," he said, "you are dismissed from this flight and your conduct will undergo a formal review." He continued, and his voice had changed register slightly. It was still clear, still grounded, but it had something warmer in it, the warmth of a person who is being accurate rather than lenient, but who wants accuracy to be understood as fully as possible. "You complied with instructions that you understood were wrong. You did that multiple times over a period of months. That is not a small thing, and the review will reflect it honestly. But you kept a record of the complaints that were being buried. You kept it when no one told you to, when it carried risk to you, when there was no obvious reward for doing it. And when the moment came this morning to say what you knew, you said it." He looked at her directly. "I cannot promise you what the review will find. What I can promise is that the 47 passengers in that archive you kept are going to hear from my office directly, and they are going to know that someone on this crew kept their names. That matters. It matters in a way that I want you to understand is not nothing." Brenda looked at him, and she didn't thank him, and he didn't expect her to. She just looked at him with the expression of someone receiving something exactly as it was given, with all its complexity intact, without simplification in either direction, and she nodded. Julian turned to Carl Briggs, who was standing near the boarding door, and who had been watching all of this with the expression of a man conducting a private inventory of his own decisions. "Mr. Briggs, you were contracted to provide security services on this aircraft, and when you arrived in response to a call from the captain, you placed your hand on a passenger without establishing cause, without asking a single question, and without performing any of the verification that your role requires before physical contact. You followed a direction without questioning it, because the direction came from someone in a uniform, and the person it was directed at was not." Julian paused. "Your contract with Apex Air Lux is terminated. The manner in which you conducted yourself here today will be documented and reported to your contracting agency." Carl's jaw moved slightly. He said nothing. Julian turned finally to Dominic Hale. "Mr. Hale, you are permanently banned from all Apex Air Lux flights effective today. Your fraudulent elite status credential has been logged with the FAA, and your corporate travel account's involvement in the payment made to a crew member for manifest alteration is being referred to corporate legal for review." He held Dominic's gaze without aggression, without satisfaction, just with the clear, flat attention of a man looking at a problem he has named correctly. "The complaint that was filed against you 9 months ago will be reviewed, investigated, and responded to, as will every complaint that was closed without action while you were a preferred passenger on this route. The people those complaints belong to deserve to know that someone read them." He stepped back slightly and addressed the cabin as a whole. This aircraft was built on a promise. That promise was broken here today by the people whose responsibility it was to keep it. It will not be broken again. The silence after the dismissals had a different quality than the silences that had preceded them throughout the morning. The earlier silences had been silences of tension, the held breath quality of people watching something dangerous and uncertain, not knowing which direction it would fall. This silence was something else. It was the silence of people who have watched something fall and who are now standing in the aftermath of it in the particular and unfamiliar air that follows a reckoning, trying to understand what they're feeling and whether they have words for it. Vera Hutchins rose from the last row. She moved the way older people move when they have decided to stand deliberately, using the armrest, not hurrying the process, owning the time it takes. And when she was upright, she stood in the aisle with the quality of a woman who has been in many rooms and has long since stopped needing to fill them with performance. She did not address Julian first. She addressed the cabin. "I want to say something," she said in a voice that was not loud but carried easily through the quiet space, with the particular quality of a voice that has been in front of many audiences, not to perform, but to speak. "And I want to say it because I've been sitting in the back of this plane for the last hour, watching something that I've been watching in various forms for 45 years, and I think it's important to name it correctly." She paused, looking around at the faces in the cabin, at Noah, who was watching her with the attention of someone who recognizes that what they're hearing is significant, at Tyler, whose phone was still recording, at Dr. Adiemi, who met her gaze with something that passed between them in the recognition of two people who have been doing a similar kind of work in different fields for a very long time. What happened on this plane today was not an exception, Vera said. It was not a rogue individual making a bad decision. It was something built over time in choices and habits and logbooks and manifest adjustments and complaints that were filed and never answered, and it was maintained because most of the people in the rooms where it was happening chose not to see it. She looked at the 4 people standing in the dismissed crew cluster near the cockpit and the galley. She did not look at them with contempt. She looked at them with something more demanding than contempt, which was clear, patient clarity. "And some of you in this cabin were in that position too," she said. And she said it without accusation, with the understanding of someone who knows how those choices feel from the inside. You saw things. You didn't film. You didn't speak immediately. Some of you looked away. She paused. And then you didn't. And the turning point, the moment this morning where what was happening started to change, was not when Mr. Moore revealed who he was. It was earlier than that. It was when the first person in this cabin decided to stay in the room and say what they saw. She looked at Noah, at Dr. Adeyemi, at Tyler, at the brief, significant moment when Vera herself had spoken for the first time from the back row. "We all have that choice," she said, "in every room we're in. And most of the time we make the easy version of it, which is to let the room sort itself out according to its existing arrangements." She let that sit for a moment. "Today a few of you made a harder version. And it mattered." She turned to Julian, and she looked at him directly with the expression of a woman who has been looking at people for 67 years and has gotten very good at seeing them. "Mr. Moore," she said, "you didn't have to be who you are to deserve that seat. None of us do. And the world you're building, if it's the one that comes from this morning, is the one where that finally stops needing to be said." She sat back down. She did not wait for applause, and there wasn't any. The cabin was too full of something heavier and more substantial than applause, the full, serious weight of people who have been through something real together and who are in the aftermath of it, quietly choosing what it means and what they're going to carry forward from it. Noah Park picked up his pen, but he didn't write for a moment. He sat with it in his hand, looking at the page, and then he wrote one sentence and underlined it. Tyler Walsh stopped his recording. He looked at the screen for a moment, looked at what he'd captured, and then put his phone in his pocket. Not because he wouldn't use it, he wasn't sure yet, but because in this specific moment, the recording felt like a smaller version of what had actually happened, and he wanted to sit with the full version for a little while longer. Dr. Adeyemi was already making notes on her brief different notes on the blank margins. The kind of notes that are the beginning of an action and not just an observation. The cabin breathed. Julian stood in the aisle and led it. It was Brenda who spoke next, and what she said changed the shape of the morning one final time. She had been standing near the galley with her hands at her sides and the expression of someone who has said the hardest thing and who is now deciding whether there is more, whether the decision to speak once made extends to everything that comes after it, or only to the single hardest sentence. She had been deciding this for the past several minutes through Vera Hutchins' words, and through the dismissals, and through the particular quality of attention in the cabin that comes from people who have been watching truth surface, and who have not yet moved away from that watching, and she had arrived finally at the same place she had arrived an hour earlier, when she walked to the panel and took out the notebook. The decision to keep going once you've started. "There's something else," she said. Julian turned toward her. Brenda reached into the bag she'd left at the foot of the galley station. Her own bag, the one she'd brought aboard before the flight separate from the airline's equipment, and she produced a personal tablet with a cracked screen in the upper left corner. The particular damage of something that gets used all the time and carried everywhere and has taken its knocks. "I've been archiving," she said, and the word came out carefully as if she had been thinking about how to say it, and had settled on the most accurate single word and was using it precisely. "For 14 months I've been keeping copies of complaints that came in through the in-flight feedback system, but that never made it to corporate compliance. I was told they'd been resolved internally. But when I checked when I asked about specific ones early on, the explanations didn't make sense. So I started saving them." She extended the tablet to Julian. He took it. He looked at the screen. The folder was labeled Routine Logs, a label that was both deliberately inconspicuous and, in the context of what it actually contained, quietly devastating, the kind of label that a person gives to something they need to keep hidden, but that they also, somewhere in the part of them that knows the difference between right and wrong, need to preserve. Diana Julian said. Diana on the phone had been listening throughout. "I'm receiving the feed," she said, and there was a quality in her voice, a restraint that was the professional version of something more that told Julian she had been looking at the same screen he was looking at and was feeling something about it that she was keeping precisely contained. 47 complaints, filed over 22 months. All marked reviewed and closed. None with any record of action taken or any response to the passenger who filed. The cabin was very still. Most of them, Diana continued, are from passengers of color. The pattern in the complaint descriptions is— She paused. It mirrors what's in the notebook. Noah Park looked up from his notes. The flagged passengers in the notebook, he said slowly, thinking aloud, and the passengers who filed complaints that were never addressed, are they the same people? Some of them, Diana said. Enough of them. The thing that was in the cabin then, the understanding that settled into the room, was not a new revelation exactly, because by this point in the morning, the shape of what had been happening on this route had become visible enough that none of its details were truly surprising. But there is a difference between seeing the outline of a thing and seeing its full dimension, and the full dimension of what Brenda's archive represented. 47 people, 47 names, 47 moments of being dismissed and ignored and silenced through the bureaucratic mechanism of a closed ticket, arrived in the cabin with its full dimension and was received in silence. Julian held the tablet for a long moment without speaking. Noah Park said quietly from 3B, "This isn't a personnel problem." He said it the way he had said something similar about the notebook, but with more gravity this time, because the notebook had shown the pattern in one person's private practice, and this showed it in the operations records in the official documentation, the formal infrastructure, the paperwork that was supposed to exist to protect people and had instead been used systematically to protect the operation from them. This is something that was built into the way the whole route was being run. Yes, Julian said. He looked at Patricia for a moment, at her stillness, at the closed-door quality of her expression, and then he looked away because there was nothing more he needed from her. And it ends here. He looked at Brenda. The archive you kept every one of these 47 complaints is going to be reviewed, and every one of these passengers is going to receive a direct response from my office, not a form letter. A personal response by name acknowledging what was filed and what it should have received and what we intend to do about it. He paused. That only happens because you didn't delete the file. I want you to understand what that means. Brenda looked at him. She was not going to receive absolution from this conversation, and she knew it, and she had somewhere in the past hour made a private peace with that understanding that what was available to her was not absolution but accuracy. And that accuracy, in this case, meant being part of the record, as both what she'd done wrong and what she'd done right. I understand, she said. Dominic Hale, who had been sitting in the back of the cabin since moving from 2A reduced, without the card and without the captive crew and without the protective machinery of the operation he'd been embedded in, said in a voice that had been stripped of all its earlier confidence and now carried only a faint last attempt at relevance. You can't pin all of this on the passengers in this cabin. This is bigger than Julian turned to him. He turned to him very slowly with the patient final attention of a man who has been generous with his time and is reaching the end of that generosity. I'm not pinning anything, he said. I'm reading what's already written. He looked at the tablet in his hands at Dominic and then back at the tablet. And what's already written is enough. Julian turned to face the 4 people who had stayed in the room, and he did it with a particular kind of attention, not the attention of a man about to give a speech, but the attention of a man who has been through something with other people and who wants, before anything else happens, to simply acknowledge that those people are present and that what they did is real. He started with Noah Park. You were here for a story before any of this happened, he said, and it was not an accusation. Just a fact, stated without judgment. But when the story stepped out of the page and into the aisle, you stayed in the aisle. You knew what you were looking at before I said a word about who I was, and you spoke to what you saw, not to what it would mean for the piece you were writing, but to what was happening in front of you. That's not journalism, Julian said. That's conscience. And the journalism that comes from it, if you write it the way you clearly know how to observe it, is going to matter to people who weren't on this plane. Noah held his pen still and looked at Julian, and then looked at his notebook, and then looked back up. He didn't say anything immediately, which was itself a kind of answer. the quiet of a person receiving something that they're going to need to carry for a while before they know what to do with it. Julian looked at Dr. Adiemi. "You kept this from becoming noise when it needed to be a signal," he said. "Every moment when someone could have turned this into a scene, when Tyler's phone went up, when the cabin was starting to react emotionally, you held the quality of it. You kept the focus on the facts, which is the hardest thing to do when what you're watching is also making you angry. That took more than legal training." He paused. "That took the kind of practice that comes from caring about what the facts are used for." "Doctor," Diemi said, "the 47 people in that archive, when your office reaches out to them if they need legal support for what comes next, I'd like to be involved. Not as a favor. As a professional interested in seeing those cases handled correctly." Julian looked at her. "That conversation will happen." He looked at Tyler Walsh. Tyler had been sitting with his phone in his lap since he'd stopped recording, in the slightly unsettled posture of someone who has been through an experience that is larger than their framework for it and who is working in real time to build a bigger framework. "I asked you not to film," Julian said. "Twice, and you listened, both times." He held Tyler's gaze for a moment, and then when it was time to speak instead, you stood up and said what you saw out loud in this cabin without knowing what would happen when you did it. You were scared. It was visible. He said it without any diminishment of the fact. You did it anyway. That's the harder choice. The camera would have been easier. Tyler looked at him. His expression was the expression of a 27-year-old who has just been seen accurately by an adult for the first time in a long time, which is an experience that sits somewhere between gratitude and something more complicated. He nodded. Julian walked to the last row. He walked the length of the cabin and stood in the aisle in front of Vera Hutchins. And he didn't speak immediately, and neither did she, and the silence between them was the comfortable silence of two people who have been through the same morning and who are standing in the aftermath of it without needing to rush to fill it. "How many times have you done this?" Julian asked finally. Vera looked at him. "Done what stayed in the room." She considered this. It was a question that could be answered quickly with a large number, but Vera Hutchins was not a woman who answered questions quickly when the questions deserved something better. "More than I can count," she said, "and less than I should have." She looked at him. "I've been in rooms where the same thing was happening and I stayed quiet because I was tired that day, or because I was calculating the cost, or because I told myself someone else would speak first. And every one of those times I made the wrong decision." She paused. "Today I was tired and I wasn't calculating and I spoke first anyway. It felt better." Julian looked at her for a long moment. "Thank you," he said, for not stopping. Vera looked at him with the kind of directness that belongs to people who have been doing hard work for a very long time, and who have arrived through the accumulation of it at a form of clarity that is almost indistinguishable from peace. "I'm 67 years old," she said. "I don't have the time to stop." He found her in the rear galley sitting on the small fold-down crew seat with her hands in her lap and her composure finally quietly gone. Not in a dramatic way, not in the way of someone who has collapsed, but in the way of someone who has been holding something for a long time and has set it down, and is now simply existing in the new lighter, stranger feeling of not holding it anymore and isn't sure what to do with that. Julian sat across from her in the jump seat that folded down from the opposite wall. He sat at the same level as her, and the equal elevation was deliberate, and she registered it. He didn't begin with a question. He began by being there in the way that sometimes a person's presence in a room before they've said anything is the most communicative thing about them. "Why did you keep the archive?" he asked after a moment. Brenda looked at her hands. "I didn't know who would ever look for it," she said. "I didn't think about having an audience. I couldn't delete the names." She paused, and what she said next was the truest thing she'd said all morning. truer even than the confessions, because it was not about facts, but about the texture of what she'd been living inside. Every time I closed one of those tickets, every time I clicked the button that said "resolved" on something that wasn't resolved, I felt it. And I told myself it was just how the operation worked, that I was new, that it wasn't my place. She looked up, but I kept the names, so I must have known. Julian nodded. He thought about the man on the flight 2 years ago, the businessman in the seat ahead of him questioned 3 times, producing his documents with the practiced patience of someone who has done it before. He thought about him being in the archive, or not being in the archive because that had been before Brenda started keeping it. He let himself think about that for a moment. "How long have you been carrying this?" he asked. "Since the 3rd or 4th time I watched it happen and nodded when I shouldn't have," she said. "So about a year." "That's a long time." "Yes." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't save the passengers who came before you started the archive," he said. "The ones who were already logged as closed and weren't coming back. I want to be honest with you about that. You kept a record, but it started 14 months ago, and before that the record doesn't exist in any form that allows us to reach those people." He said it without cruelty, without softening it beyond what it deserved, because Brenda was a person who had chosen the harder truth this morning, and she deserved the harder truth in return. But you kept a record from the moment you started, and sometimes that's what allows someone else to do the work that comes next. Brenda looked at him. "Your employment review will be what it is," he said. "I can't promise its outcome. What I can tell you is that the 47 passengers in your archive are going to receive a phone call from my office. Their names are going to be read. Their complaints are going to be investigated and responded to, and your decision to preserve them is going to be part of the record that makes that possible." He paused. "I need you to know that. Whatever else happens, I need you to carry that." He stood to leave. At the galley door, she spoke without looking up. "I'm sorry I didn't do it sooner." Julian paused. He didn't turn around immediately. He let the words be in the air for a moment, receiving them with the full weight she had put into them. "So am I," he said. He meant it in every direction for her, for the passengers who'd come before the archive for the year of mornings on this route that had happened without anyone stopping them. He let the meaning sit in all its directions, and then he walked back into the cabin. Dominic Hale had moved himself to the rear of the cabin when Julian took his seat, not at Julian's direction, but at the quiet instruction of his own understanding of what the room now was and what he was in it. He had chosen the last row near the window on the opposite side from Vera Hutchins, which told you something about the particular quality of his discomfort, that he would still make a seating calculation in those circumstances, still choose placement relative to the people in the room, even in the middle of what the room had become. He was sitting with his phone in his hand when Julian approached, and the phone was a habit, something to look at, so he didn't have to look at anything else. But he put it face down when Julian stopped in the aisle beside him. "I want to be clear about a few things before you leave this aircraft," Julian said, and his voice was the same voice it had been throughout, not raised, not cold, just clear with the characteristic quality of someone who has prepared for this conversation and is delivering it at the level of precision it requires. Dominic said, "I'm going to have legal counsel. Review everything that's your right," Julian said without any of the defensiveness that the mention of legal counsel is usually intended to produce. "Review it. Have whoever you like review it. The fraudulent credential is in the FAA log already. The manifest alteration and the payment trace are with corporate legal. The complaint that was filed against you 9 months ago is being reopened, and the passenger who filed it is going to receive a call from my office this week." He paused. "Your lawyers are going to be dealing with facts, not impressions, and the facts are going to be straightforward." Dominic looked at him. He was. Julian noted a man who, in another context, in a conference room, in a client meeting, in any of the dozens of rooms that Dominic Hale moved through in a given month, was probably formidable, probably articulate, probably capable of handling himself with the kind of smooth, practiced confidence that came from decades of operating in environments where the weight of the room's assumptions was on his side. In this context, stripped of the credential and the crew and the protective machinery of the preferred status, he was just a man who had done something wrong and was sitting with it. "I built my career," Dominic said, and the sentence came out as something different from what it had been intended to be. It started as a defense and arrived as a statement of loss, as if the act of saying it aloud had revealed the full diminished shape of what it actually meant in this moment. "I know," Julian said, and there was no satisfaction in his voice when he said it, and no cruelty. Just the steady, honest acknowledgement that the stakes were real and the reckoning was real, and both of those things were true at the same time. "And what you built it on, in part, was the expectation that certain rooms would arrange themselves in your favor before you arrived. That stops here." The airport security that Diana had summoned actual O'Hare airport security, not contracted formal, arrived through the boarding door 2 minutes later and waited at the head of the aisle in the quiet way of people who have been told what the situation is and who are prepared to manage it without drama. Dominic stood. He moved through the cabin toward the door, and as he passed the rows of passengers, no one looked away from him. No one stared aggressively or made any sound. They simply looked with the clear, level attention of people who have seen something clearly and are not going to pretend otherwise. And he passed through their looking and reached the door and stepped through it. No one said anything after he left. The door closed and the cabin exhaled, and the particular quality of his absence was in its own way more communicative than anything that had been said in the last hour. He had been in the last row throughout the entire morning, and Julian had noticed him, had registered his presence in the early assessment of the cabin, the blue blazer and the faded pin and the retired captain's posture, the way he'd sat with his hands folded and watched everything with the expression of someone undergoing a private reckoning, separate from the public one happening in the aisle, but had not addressed him because the man had not spoken, and because Julian understood that some reckoning required its own time and could not be brought forward by external prompting. The man stood now slowly, with the deliberate economy of movement of someone for whom standing has become a considered act rather than an automatic one. "Mr. Moore," he said, "may I speak?" "Of course," Julian said. The man cleared his throat in the way of someone who has been composing a sentence for a long time and is discovering at the moment of delivery that the composed version is not quite right and must be abandoned for something less prepared and more true. "My name is Arthur Venn," he said. "I flew private aviation for 32 years. I retired 4 years ago. I'm traveling as a passenger today, just a passenger, but I know this operation because I know the people who built it before you acquired it." He paused. "And I know Patricia Sloan. I trained her 20 years ago. I recommended her for command when she was ready. I stood up for her later when complaints came in, the first ones 12 years ago, from passengers I should have believed and didn't." The cabin was completely still. Arthur Venn continued, and his voice was steady with the particular steadiness of someone who is not trying to be brave, but who has simply arrived after a long time at the point where saying the true thing is less costly than continuing to not say it. "I told myself it was loyalty. I told myself I knew her better than the complaints did. I told myself that the passengers who filed them had probably misread the situation, that Patricia was difficult, but not this." He stopped. I was wrong. And I knew I was wrong somewhere for a long time. But I had built a professional relationship with her, and I had put my recommendation behind her career, and I did not want to be the person who had been wrong about that. So I stayed silent. He looked at the floor for a moment, while she built what she built in that logbook, while the complaints went unanswered. I was one of the people who made that possible, not by doing it by looking away from it. And I'm 68 years old, and I'm tired of knowing that about myself. He looked at Julian. "I don't need anything from this," he said, and the quality of the statement was genuinely unburdened. He was not asking for absolution, was not seeking acknowledgement, was not managing how his confession was received. I needed to say it in front of people who deserved to hear it. Julian walked to him. He walked the length of the aisle slowly and stood in front of Arthur Venn and looked at him with the full direct attention he had given to everyone this morning, and then he extended his hand. Arthur Venn took it. "Courage doesn't expire with age," Julian said. "And truth spoken late is still truth." Arthur Venn held his hand for a moment and then released it and sat back down, and the quality of his sitting was different now. Not lighter exactly, because the weight was still there, would always be there. That was the nature of what he'd carried, and there was no changing the years it had taken, but more settled, as if his body had found a way to hold it that it hadn't had before. In 3, B. Noah Park had picked up his pen and then set it back down. Some things he understood needed to remain in the room where they happened, not documented, not reported, not turned into narrative, just held by the people who were there, who had heard them, who would carry them forward in the way that mattered most, which was in themselves. He looked at his empty page for a moment. Then he picked the pen back up and wrote one line. He folded the page in half and kept it. A replacement crew arrived 20 minutes later, 2 of Apex's senior flight staff, both of whom had been contacted by Diana within the first 30 minutes of the incident and had come directly from their own morning preparations without a single complaint about the Saturday timing or the short notice, because Diana had told them only that Mr. Moore needed them, and they had understood what that meant. They moved through the cabin with the quiet competence of people who do not need to perform their professionalism, who have arrived not to make a statement about the situation, but simply to do the job that needs doing. And the cabin responded to them with the particular relief that comes from competence appearing after its absence has been felt. The dismissed crew had been collected. Patricia and Rafferty had been escorted to the terminal by Diana's direction, their personal effects retrieved from the cockpit and passed through the door in a manner that was logistically efficient and emotionally unremarkable, which was its own dignity, a refusal to make theater of what was already in its own way a serious and sufficient thing. Carl Briggs had left the moment the airport security arrived for Dominic slipping through the boarding door in the manner of a man who has completed a quiet recalculation of his morning and found the result uncomfortable. Brenda sat in the rear galley waiting for the compliance officer Diana had dispatched who would arrive within the hour. The cabin was quiet in the particular way of people who have been through something real together and who are not yet ready to move fully away from it, who are still processing, still sitting with the fullness of what they've experienced, still carrying the morning's weight without having decided where to put it down. Julian stood in the aisle near the front of the cabin, and the scarf that had fallen from his arm when Carl Briggs had grabbed his shoulder, that had lain on the cream carpet of the aisle through the entire long middle of the morning, was still there near the foot of seat 2A, which was now empty, which had always been his. He bent down and picked it up. He picked it up the same way he had picked up the boarding pass, slowly, without drama, with the unhurried deliberateness of a man performing a small act that is also in its context a large one. The act of picking up something that was taken from you and carrying it home in your own hands. He folded the scarf over his arm. He straightened up. He walked to seat 2A and sat down. Not to prove something, not to make a point, just because it was his seat, and it had always been his seat, and sitting in it now was simply the continuation of a Saturday morning that had started before anyone on this aircraft had tried to end it, and that was going to continue today, and on the flights that came after today, and in the work that came after those flights, with the same steady, patient, absolutely necessary persistence. That was, Julian Moore had long understood the only quality that actually changed anything. He looked out the window. The tarmac was the same. The ground crew moved with the same ordinary efficiency. The morning light had shifted since he'd boarded. It was fuller now. The sun higher. The long early shadows contracted into something more direct, and the world outside the window was entirely indifferent to what had happened inside it. because the world was large and the cabin was small, and the ground crew had luggage to move. This was fine. The world's indifference did not diminish the thing that had happened. It just reminded Julian in the way that early morning airports always reminded him of the proportion of things, how much of the work was quiet, how little of it required the world's attention to be real, how the most important changes were often the ones that happened without announcement in spaces that looked from the outside like nothing was occurring. He closed his eyes, just for one moment. Then he opened them, reached into his tote, and pulled out the folder Diana had given him 3 days ago. The audit of complaint records, the beginning of the long work, and he began to read. 3 days later, Julian was in his office in the South Side building where Apex Ventures had started and where it was still headquartered, because Julian had never seen a reason to move and because the building was on a street he knew and the street was in a neighborhood he came from. And those things mattered to him in the specific, unperformative way that things matter when they're part of who you actually are rather than who you're presenting yourself as. He had not given any interviews. The story had broken anyway through Noah Park's piece, which ran in 3 publications within 36 hours of the flight, and which Julian had read twice. One of the finest pieces of observational journalism he'd encountered in a long time. Not because it was dramatic, but because it was precise, and through Tyler Walsh's social media statement, which was 3 paragraphs of plain, clean prose that described what Tyler had seen and said and felt, without embellishment, without the framing of outrage or triumph, just the record of a person who had been in a room and had made a choice about what to do while he was there. Tyler had turned down 2 podcast requests. Julian knew this because Diana had told him, and Diana had told him because she tracked these things with the attentiveness of someone who understood that how a story traveled was as important as the story itself. The internal announcement to Apex Airlux staff had gone out the day after the flight. It was not a press release. It was a letter addressed to every employee across every operation from ground crew to senior staff that described what had happened in the cabin. Not in the sanitized language of corporate communications, but in plain terms because Julian believed that the people who worked for him deserved to know what they were part of and what it was going to become. The letter described the dismissals. It described the complaint archive. It described the audit that was beginning immediately, and what the audit would look at and who would conduct it and what the findings would produce. It described the Apex Sky Trust, an $18 million fund that would be allocated across 3 years for pilot scholarships crew, diversity training, and a new internal equity team that would report directly to Julian's office, not as a press release announcement, not as a public commitment designed to produce favorable coverage, but as a structural fact about the company that was now simply true. And it described the 47 passengers. Not by name, their privacy was not Julian's to distribute, but by the fact of them, 47 complaints filed in good faith received by the company's systems, and allowed to disappear without response or investigation, or any acknowledgement that the person who had trusted the system enough to file a complaint deserved the basic dignity of a reply. The letter said that all 47 of those passengers would receive a personal communication from Julian's office that week, not a form letter. A personal response addressed to each of them by name, acknowledging specifically what they had reported and what the company had failed to do with it. Diana read him the response rate on the 4th day 44 of 47 had written back. Some were angry, the particular anger of people who had tried to believe in a system and had been let down by it, and who needed before anything else to say clearly, and without moderation, how that had felt, and how long they had been carrying it. Julian read those letters first because they were the hardest, and because the hardest things were where the actual information lived. Some were relieved in ways that showed between the lines of careful formal language how uncertain they had been that anyone would ever read what they'd written, how much the act of filing a complaint into what had felt like a void had cost them, and how much it meant to find years later that the void had not been infinite after all. Some were both in proportions that shifted sentence by sentence in ways that Julian found more moving than either alone. He read every letter. He read them at his desk in the early morning before the rest of the building arrived with a black coffee he remembered to drink while it was still warm, and he kept them in a folder that was separate from the audit file and from the legal documentation and from the strategic materials, because they were not any of those things. They were the reason. He had not written back to all of them yet. He would. He was taking the time to do it correctly, which meant taking the time to do it personally, which meant it would take as long as it took. Noah Park's story ran first in a long-form aviation publication and was picked up by 2 national outlets within the day. It focused not on Julian's identity, but on what the notebook had revealed on the 2 years and 4 months of a private sorting system embedded in the operation of a route, and on the 47 complaints that had been filed and silenced, and on the specific structural way that the patterns in the notebook and the patterns in the complaint archive mirrored each other, which was the journalism. The thing that moved beyond the event in the cabin and into the shape of the thing that had built it. The piece won a journalism award 6 months later. Noah, when told, said he was glad, but thought the more important thing was the 4 airlines that had announced internal complaint review audits in the 2 weeks following the piece's publication, which was what happened when the journalism did its actual job. Dr. Simone Adeyemi filed a formal complaint with the FAA on behalf of the 47 passengers within a week of the flight. She filed it without charging any of them for her time, which she explained to Julian when he asked not as charity but as the straightforward application of her professional abilities to a situation that required them, which was, she said, what she had gone to law school for. Tyler Walsh turned down both podcast requests and 1 book deal inquiry, and went back to his job where he was, by his own account, the same person he had been before the flight, and also somehow not entirely. He told one friend about the morning and described it briefly. The friend asked if he'd filmed it. Tyler said he had for part of it. The friend asked if the footage was good. Tyler thought about this for a moment and then said it was fine, but it wasn't the part that mattered. Vera Hutchins sent Julian a handwritten note that arrived at his office on the 8th day after the flight. It was written on plain white paper in a clear, deliberate hand, and it was 2 sentences. I've been watching this fight since before you were born. It's good to see it winning. Julian kept it on his desk without framing it. He set it flat to the left of the keyboard where he could look at it without looking for it. Brenda Osei's employment review concluded as she had understood it would. The finding was termination. The financial misconduct was too clearly documented to result in any other outcome, and Julian had told her honestly in the galley that honesty would not change the verdict, only the record around it. The record showed that she had preserved the archive, that she had confessed voluntarily before being confronted with the evidence, and that her cooperation had materially enabled the investigation. The FAA's complaint proceedings cited her archive as primary evidence. Her name appeared in the final determination as a cooperating party. The complaint filed by Dr. Adeyemi named Brenda's archive as the documentary foundation of the case. She was not absolved. She was seen accurately, which was different and in the long run more durable. Arthur Venn wrote a letter to Patricia Sloan. Julian knew this because Arthur had told him in a brief note sent through the Apex corporate address that he intended to write it and thought Julian should know. He did not say what the letter contained. Julian did not ask. Some things existed in the space between 2 people and were not anyone else's to witness, and this was one of them. Patricia Sloan's FAA case was ongoing. Rafferty's suspension was under review. Carl Briggs's contracting agency received the formal report and opened their own internal process. Dominic Hale's legal team contacted Apex Corporate Counsel 10 days after the flight. The conversation, Diana told Julian, was brief. 6 weeks later, Julian was back at O'Hare at 7:55 in the morning. Same terminal, same light. The same particular quality of early morning airport quiet that he had always found restful, the honesty of people moving through space with purpose rather than performance. He got his coffee black from the same counter and sat in the same chair by the floor-to-ceiling window and watched the ground crew move equipment in the long, clear light of an early spring morning. The gate agent who processed his boarding pass was someone he hadn't seen before younger, with the slightly harried energy of someone covering an early shift who is still finding the rhythm of it. She took his pass, scanned it, glanced at the screen, and waved him through without a second look. Not indifferent, she said. Have a great flight, and she meant it, or at least said it in the way of someone who hadn't decided not to mean it, but unremarkable, which was the point. The transaction was exactly as frictionless as it should have been for everyone. Julian walked down the jet bridge and boarded the aircraft. He took 2A. No one was in it. No one questioned it. Brenda was not there, and neither was Patricia, and neither was Carl. And the crew that met him at the door were people who had been briefed on the equity standards that had come out of the Apex internal announcement, who knew what the route had been and what it was now required to be, and who greeted him with the particular combination of professionalism and ease that is the actual product of genuine service rather than the performance of it. Julian settled into the seat and looked out the window. The tarmac was the same. The orange vests and the conveyor belts and the ground crew moving with their ordinary, purposeful efficiency. All of it the same, indifferent to what had happened 6 weeks ago on the other side of this glass. Indifferent in the good way, in the way of a world that continues regardless, that does not require any particular morning to have been significant in order to keep moving. He set his coffee on the armrest. He reached into his tote and took out the folder, the one with the letters, the 44 responses from the 47 passengers, the ones he was still in the process of answering one by one personally, as carefully as each of them deserved. He had 7 left. He uncapped his pen, opened to the next letter, and read it once fully, slowly, from the first word to the last, the way he read all of them, and then he took a clean sheet of paper and began to write. Outside, the morning continued. The flight would board in 20 minutes. The engines would start, and the aircraft would move, and the route would operate as it had always been supposed to operate, and the people on it would be treated as they had always deserved to be treated, and most of them would never know that a Saturday morning 6 weeks ago had been the reason. That was fine. The work did not require their knowledge to be real. It required only this: a man at a window with a pen in his hand, and 7 letters left to write, doing the thing that turns a moment into something that outlasts it, one name at a time in the early morning light before the rest of the world had caught up with what he was building. The last letter he would write that morning was to a man who had filed his complaint 3 years ago. It began, I read what you wrote, all of it, and I'm sorry it took this long for someone to write back. He wrote until the boarding announcement came. Then he capped his pen, folded the letters carefully, and looked out the window one last time. The ground crew finished their work. The jet bridge extended. The door opened. He was ready. If this story moved you, please share it, because justice doesn't fly itself. Subscribe to our channel and let's keep telling the stories that matter.